Welcome everyone to the complete free AZ-900 course, Azure Fundamentals. My name is Sullivan. I'm an AZ-900 certified, and I'm going to be your instructor for this completely free Azure course. Today we're on day 3, and today we're going to be learning cloud services types. For your Azure Fundamentals certification, you have to be able to describe cloud service types. And we're going to learn to be able to describe infrastructure as servers, also known as IaaS or ES, platform as service, PaaS. You're going to be able to describe software as service, SaaS, and also you're going to be able to identify appropriate use cases for each cloud service. It can be either IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS. Software as service is a cloud computing model where the provider delivers fully built, ready to use software, also known as applications over the internet. This is the most simple definition that I can find for you guys. And some of the software as service that are the most common out there is like Zoom, Slack, and Microsoft 365 applications that you might get some questions regarding, like what are some common software that are used for software as a service. So remember this for your exam. For your AZ-900, you have to be able to identify cases and where would I use some of these software as service. So some of the appropriate cases is for standard business productivity. You can also use for cross-team collaborations. You can use all this software as a service for cross-team collaborations. You can also use it as well for high-level monitoring. And some key Microsoft examples, remember this for your exam: Microsoft 365, Microsoft Teams, and Azure Log Central. If you guys can you can pause the video, read through all of this if you want, but these are some of the appropriate cases that you will see for your AZ-900. Platform as service, also known as PaaS, is a cloud computing model where the provider manages the underlying hardware, operating system, and software tools. You can think about platform as a service that web developers use the platform, use the base. So remember platform, remember base. So the provider manages the underlying hardware, remember that, the operating system, and the software tools. And some of the key terms that you're going to remember for your test are going to be web developer, database, and databases. Here are some platform as service use cases and some Azure examples. And some of the appropriate use cases where you use this for new and web app deployments to build highly scalable backend app APIs. Serverless workloads is another way where you can give a use case to use, and also to manage databases. And some key Azure examples that you're going to see, remember this for your test, it'll be Azure App Service, Azure SQL Database, and some of the Azure functions, where functions are highly dynamically scalable serverless compute options running code based on user events. Remember this for your test. Infrastructure as a service. It provides you access to virtualized computing resources, networks, and storage without buying physical servers. Basically, over here you have the whole infrastructure. You have the servers, you have the cables, you have everything. The only thing is that you don't buy the physical stuff. Microsoft, in this case, will provide all the servers, all the infrastructure for you, so you can have almost full control. The only thing that you won't be able to control is the physical, but you will have the whole infrastructure for you. And for IaaS, or infrastructure as service, some use case and Azure examples will be, some appropriate use cases will be the lift and shift migration. For example, you want to replace everything that is on premises, like your servers, you want to move everything to the cloud. Infrastructure as service will be a good recommendation. Also for specific configurations or dependencies, for example, you want to run applications that require custom operating system environments, legacy software, that'll be another good test. And also if you want to do some sort of development test, sandboxing, this is another good example where it can be an appropriate use case. And some key Azure examples, remember virtual machines. You'll be able to control Microsoft virtual machines or Azure virtual machines, where they are on the scalable and demand secure compute resources, providing root access permissions. You can do VM scale sets, which VM scale sets, remember this for your test, they automate groups of identical virtual machines for programmatic infrastructure scale and also Azure storage disks. Here I created a chart for you to be able to visualize the customer responsibility and the appropriate percentage of resource management overhead that falls directly on their customer, in this case the user, is the responsibility rather than the provider. So in an infrastructure as a service, 85% is managed by the customer, the user. In a platform as a service, 40% is managed by the user, and then in a software as a service, only 10% is managed by the user. Here's a quick recap of what we learned today. And today we learned to describe cloud service types. We learned to describe infrastructure as service. We learned that you have 80% control of the whole infrastructure except the physical hardware or like all the stuff where it's located. We learned how to describe platform as service. We learned that that's used mainly for web developers. And when it comes to databases, people that are in charge of that, they will be the ones using platform as service. And we learned how to describe software as service, which is the most common use almost by anyone. And some examples, remember, we have Microsoft 365, Zoom, Slack, and we'll learn also how to identify appropriate use cases for each cloud service type: infrastructure as service, platform as service, and software as service. And as you guys already know, at the end of every day on this specific course, we do 5 to 10 practice questions to test our knowledge. So let's start with our questions for today. So we're going to start with question number 1, and question number 1 says, which cloud service model requires the consumer to manage the operating system, middleware, and runtime? So when it comes to managing the operating system, that's going to be infrastructure as a service, where I'm going to be in charge of the middleware and the runtime and the operating system. So remember, if they talk about operating system, that's going to be infrastructure as service. So infrastructure as service provides the most control, leaving the management of the operating system, middleware, and applications to the consumer while providing the managing physical hardware. Next, a startup wants to remember, if you can pause the questions and then try to answer by yourself, that's I think the best way to learn, but I'll give you the explanation at the end. So if you can pause the video and then try to do it, I recommend that I'm doing that. So a startup wants to develop and deploy a new web application without the overhead of managing server updates or hardware. Which model is the most appropriate? So let's read it again because this is a tricky question. A startup wants to develop and deploy new web application without the overload of managing new updates or hardware. So I don't want to be in charge of updating the operating system. So that's going to be our platform as a service, because if I want to be able to do the updates of the operating system and all that stuff, it should be infrastructure as a service, because I don't want to be in charge of that. That's just, I only need the platform. So platform as a service provides a framework for developers to build applications without worrying about managing the underlying server or operating systems. Question number 3. In the context of shared responsibility model, we learned about the shared responsibility model remember before. Which component is always responsible? Is always the responsibility of the customer, regardless of the cloud server type. This is a great question. Remember this question for your test. Pay attention to this because I think it's a great question. So the customer is always going to be responsible for the information and data. Always the customer is always responsible for the information and data that they store on the cloud. Next, Microsoft 365 is an example of which cloud service model? What is the example of 365? Remember I talked about Microsoft 365, and Microsoft 365 is an example of software as a service. M365 is centrally hosted software that is licensed on a subscription basis and accessed via web browsers or thin clients. Question number 5. Which of the following scenarios is a primary use case for infrastructure as a service? Hosting a web application with automatically scaling log, that could be. Providing an email service for all company employees, that's more like a platform as a service. Migrating a legacy application that requires a specific operating system version, that's even better. And analyzing big data using pre-configured machine learning models. I will go with migrating. This is a tricky one, but I'm going to choose migrating legacy application that requires the operating system, because remember, when I talk about infrastructure as service, I'm usually referring as the whole operating system, and infrastructure as service is great for managing all legacy operating systems. Okay, we got another one. Question number 6. In which model is the cloud provider responsible for managing the physical servers, storage, and networking hardware? So we have where the cloud provider will be responsible for managing the physical servers, storage, and the networking hardware. Of course, on-premises is automatically disqualified first, because on an on-premises, you are going to be responsible for managing all of that. Only on an infrastructure as service, yes, they are. But I would say they are responsible on infrastructure as service, platform as service, and software as service. So they're always going to be responsible in all of this. So in public cloud service model, the provider is responsible for the physical infrastructure. No matter which one of these it is, they are always going to be responsible for this, except your servers are on premises. Question number 7. If you know questions, like post it on the comments. If you have questions, post it on the comments, because this course is completely free, guys. A company wants to host its SQL database in Azure, but does not want to manage the underlying Windows Server operating system. Which servers type should they choose? Remember when I talk about databases, and when we are talking about databases, most of the time we're referring as a platform as a service. So Azure SQL Database is a platform offering that provides the database engine without needing the management of the operating system or hardware. Question number 8. Which cloud service model is typically used for lift and shift migrations, where an existing server is moved to the cloud with minimal changes? So okay, this one's a very, very tricky question. We might get this wrong, but let's read it very carefully. Which cloud service model is typically used for lift and shift? So I want to be able to lift and shift migrations where an existing server is moved to the cloud with minimal changes. Okay, so I'm thinking that is infrastructure as service. Software as service, I'm going to eliminate it, because I'm not talking about any specific application. I'm going to delete platform as service, because I'm also not talking about some SQL databases or like some web store. And public cloud storage, that might be like data. So if I'm only moving data, but I'm moving the whole server. So yep, infrastructure as service allows you to create virtual machines that mirror your on-premises servers, making it standard for lift and shift migrations. Next. Question number 9. A developer is using Azure App Servers to host a web API. In this scenario, who's responsible for patching the underlying operating system? Okay, so a developer is using Azure App Servers to host API. In this scenario, who's responsible for patching the underlying system? Pause the video and then try to see if you can figure out. And I'm gonna say that the responsible for updating is gonna be the Microsoft Azure team, because I'm not only doing platform as a service, but if I was doing infrastructure as a service, I will be responsible. But because I'm only hosting the platform, Azure have to be responsible for the maintenance of the operating system and the security. And our last question, question number 10. Which cloud model is best described as pay-as-you-go? I don't think I covered this on the stuff, but let's read it. Software licensing and delivery model. So which one do you guys think? You guys can pause the video and then see which one it is. So I will say that pay-as-you-go software licensing and delivery model, it might be a software as a service, because software as a service is a distribution model where the third-party provider hosts applications and makes them available to customers all over the internet. So this was our last question for today, guys. Congratulations, you made it to the end of day 3. Thank you for being here. All I ask for you is subscribe to the channel, share this free Azure course to your friends, family, anyone that wants to take your certification. And if you like this type of content, help me giving a like, help me, and I'll see you guys on day 4 of this completely free AZ-900 course.